Hello folks, let's talk about event trigger transforms. Let's say I have an event trigger and I'm triggering it using some operations, and I have a webhook which expects the data in a certain format. Now what used to happen was my trigger used to send the payload in a specific format which is shown here, and I had to use some third party sources to convert that data, or I had to convert that data within my webhook itself. Now what we can do is we can convert this data within the Hasura console itself. So this is the screenshot of Hasura console, and this sample input is what the payload would be, right? And we will use a templating language to convert that data into into the format that we need. So now the diagram looks like this, where we have the data, we convert it within our console using the transforms, and we get the data. The data which will be sent to the webhook will be in the format that we need it to be. It's a pretty useful feature, and I'll be showing the demo of how to do this now. So I'll try to create an event trigger now. Let's go to create section. Let's say new trigger. I'll keep the default database. I'll select the public schema, and I'll select the users table. Now we'll trigger on the insert operations, and for webhook I have this code sandbox, which this is the base path, and add /users. It just outputs the data that it gets from the payload, so that we can see what data are we getting from Hasura. So it will output it here in the terminal, right? And then this base path for this, it's stored in my webhook env and basically what we'll need is /users path, and we'll show how to transform it into using the transformations to meet our needs. So let's say I'll use it here, and now I need to open the request options transform, which will basically allow me to transform the URL. And when I go here, it says missing env, right? So the Hasura console does not have access to that env because env could contain sensitive information, and will not expand those env. But for the purpose of if I save it right now, it will work, but for the preview is not working. So for the purpose of making this preview work, there is a sample context section where the users could add their env values, and they could add mock env values just for the sake of making this preview work and seeing like how will their transformed URL would look like, right? So I'll add something here. I'll just add test.com, and you can see that the URL comes in here, right? And I need to transform it to /users, right? And this is good. Now we need the body. Let's say I need a table name and I need the data. Right, this table name, and I'll get the data from body.event. As you can see, there is also an autocomplete which gets keywords from the sample input section, and it gives you an autocomplete feature. So .data.new, this should work. This is basically the payload that will be sent to my webhook, right? Now if I want to change something, right, like if I want to do delete and update operations, and I want my sample input to be representative of that, then I can hit this reset button, and then it will update the sample input, and you can use it accordingly in the request body section, right? But this is good enough for now. We'll go ahead and create this trigger, new trigger, and let's go to the data tab, let's go to the users table, and let's try to insert something and see if our trigger works, right? First name first, last name last. If I save it, if I go to my webhook now, we can see that the data comes, and this is the new data, and then the table name comes, and this is the transformed data that we have.
we looked at kind of event triggers and kind of what it lets you do, right? And you saw that this ability that you can kind of go into event triggers, configure that, and then you're able to kind of execute and run against webhooks without having to transform the payload in some kind of middleware lambda that you'd have to usually write. So we introduced this for actions first. And so that kind of made it easy for us to bring in kind of GraphQL APIs or bring in existing REST APIs into our actions pretty easily. And via actions, bring that into our GraphQL API pretty easily with that transformer. We then kind of brought in the same templating thing into event triggers, which is what Abhijit just demoed. And so you kind of see that here where you can kind of go in and set up event trigger transformations, right? And this is neat. I'll take kind of two interesting examples of where we can, of where event triggers become useful. One is pretty obvious, where if you have an event trigger, and usually the first example that people often think of is if something happens, send an email. And so you'll see an example with SendGrid, and you should be able to run that example and try that out as well. So whenever there's an event that happens, what this does is you can kind of set it up with an API key. And once you have the API key, you can have an event trigger that directly shoots off an email via SendGrid. So you don't have to have a middleware kind of thing in the middle, like a Lambda that takes Hasura's event trigger, converts that into SendGrid's API call, and then call SendGrid. You can just directly call SendGrid from Hasura. So this is kind of what that metadata looks like. If you view the metadata underlying kind of what is happening on the console, you see an event trigger definition that is there for an insert on the user model. And you're seeing that it's going to call the SendGrid API directly. And there's a transformation here that converts our event payload, which is the user object, right, into kind of the transformation or into the body that SendGrid's API will expect. Right, so that's the kind of you should be able to try this out very easily. You'll find this on Hasura/DataHub, where we're starting to collect a bunch of these examples. So you'll find this on DataHub as well. So try it out, and if of course we have any ideas for other kinds of examples that you tried out or that you want to see, just feel free to open up an issue on DataHub or on GraphQL Engine itself. So that's kind of one example of what you can do with event triggers. There's another example. Another interesting thing that you can do with the ability to kind of call anything from an event trigger or a cron trigger, and that's kind of what I'll just step into next. So if you think about kind of the we've often had this thing when we're kind of using event triggers, you want to clean up kind of event data, right? So let me just take an example. Oops. Right, Hasura event trigger, right? And so let's say, for example, you want to run an operation that kind of cleans out event triggers, right? When they at a certain interval, let's say every day you want to clean out all the invocation logs and stuff like that, because millions of invocation logs have happened and you want to clean that out. Now, what you would have had to do is like run this SQL, which basically cleans out the event trigger log with whatever frequency, right? So you would have had to set it up. Now what you can do is you can use Hasura's cron triggers to run the SQL against Hasura to clean up those event triggers directly, right? And so, by the way, this is something you want to be very, very careful with and not kind of like use it very often. But let me just take you over what that looks like, right? So what I've done here in this example is I've set up a user model, right? I'm just going to add some things here. So let's say name 6, name 7, name 8, name 9, right? And this kind of creates events as you would expect, right? So we have a bunch of events that just happened that are kind of correlated to the insert events that I just did, right? And that kind of results in certain these are the invocation logs that Hasura has captured, right? So these are the events that I just created with name 5, name 6, name 7, whatever. And so these event logs just got created. What I've also now done is I've added a cron trigger that basically runs the cleanup SQL back against Hasura itself. And then that kind of cleans this up every minute, right? So we'll see this kind of this event log data getting cleaned up every minute. And so I'll just show you what the underlying SQL looks like. This is what it looks like. I added a cron trigger here, and the cron trigger uses the same transformation technique, this is using pretty lang, right? And what it's doing is it's actually just calling back to the same Hasura instance and running this SQL to delete from the invocation logs, right? So I'm kind of able to kind of run that back against Hasura to run kind of these kinds of things. So I could use this for things like, refreshing materialized views if I need to, right? Running any kind of batch things that I want to, cleaning up events is one example, and kind of doing stuff like that. So the thing to be careful about here, though, is that if you start realizing what you can also do, because this is pretty lang, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. You can also start to template the SQL inside this, right? So you can kind of start parameterizing it and start running parameterized SQL queries, but that becomes really dangerous. And we'll kind of when we document this, we'll talk about this so that you want to be really careful in kind of exposing that, because that might lead to kind of SQL injection type things if you're not being careful about how you're passing the parameter in. So if you start realizing that you're kind of doing more advanced versions of this, an approach that I would recommend is kind of creating admin functions like SQL functions, and exposing them as GraphQL mutations. And then just using request transforms to actually call those GraphQL mutations back into Hasura, right? So you can have a GraphQL mutation to like clean up events, or a GraphQL mutation to like an admin mutation to refresh materialized view. And these are admin only. And what you can do with a cron trigger or an event trigger is kind of just call those mutations again. And now, because it's a GraphQL mutation, you're not running raw SQL, you're actually calling a SQL method. So it's parameterized carefully and stuff like that. So as you kind of get into those use cases, that option becomes possible. So we'll share these in the descriptions for the call so that you folks can kind of take this for a spin as well. But there's all sorts of cool things that become possible by just being able to call Hasura back from Hasura itself with either event triggers or with run SQL. For example, if you're using Hasura's caching, you can use event triggers to invalidate the cache with the event trigger directly, right? So that kind of becomes